Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 11th of March 2026. We're delighted to welcome the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Honourable Rachel Reeves MP, who is joined by Dharmesh Nayi, who's the Director of Strategy, Planning and Budget at His Majesty's Treasury. We're obviously covering the issues raised by the Chancellor in the Spring Statement, or indeed in the EFO, the Economic and Fiscal Outlook document produced by the Office for Budget Responsibility. And since this session was planned, obviously we've seen major international events in the world, so we do want to kick off with the situation in Iran. I'm going to ask John Grady MP to kick off. Mr. Grady.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. Chancellor, what does the Iran war mean for inflation, interest rates and growth?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dame Meg, for inviting me back after the spring forecast to give evidence. And yes, even when I delivered my spring forecast last Tuesday, it was obvious that there was disruptions to markets and prices. But I would say, I think, as the Office of Budget Responsibility said yesterday to your committee, that it is too soon to be able to tell what the impact of this is. As a government and in my role as Chancellor, we are working hard to de-escalate the conflict, because the best chance of having a minimal economic impact is to de-escalate the conflict and to see vessels moving again through the Strait of Hormuz. And so at this stage, I think it would be unwise to speculate on what the impact on inflation, growth or interest rates would be. But of course, we are looking at a number of scenarios and monitoring very carefully the situation. But the quicker we can de-escalate, the better it will be for all of those different economic variables.
The panellists we had yesterday, Chancellor, were all clear that this was bad news for the British economy. There are no bright spots in it. Would you concur with those panellists?
Well, certainly not good for the British economy to have trade disrupted, and especially when so much oil and gas comes from that part of the world. But the best thing that we can do as a government is to seek to de-escalate this conflict.
And how, Chancellor, are you helping or working to de-escalate this conflict?
Yes, well, as you know, G7 finance ministers met on Monday, G7 energy ministers met yesterday, and today leaders will meet. At the meeting that I attended on Monday, we had the head of the International Energy Agency at the meeting. They are consulting with members right now on the release of oil reserves, strategic oil reserves. I've been very clear that the UK is willing to play its part in using those reserves to put downward pressure on oil prices and ensure that supply remains strong. So that's one of the ways in which we are responding, but also working, for example, with Lloyd's of London. I met the chair, Charles Roxburgh, on Monday, and also working with the US administration on and other key allies in trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and making sure that vessels feel confident to travel through it, and that insurance products are available at the right prices. At the moment, the issue is not so much insurance products, but the safety of captains and crews of those vessels. But we're working closely with both our allies in the Gulf and in the G7, and also with the insurance industry to ensure that as quickly as possible we can get those movements going again.
Are you clear about what would make traffic up the Strait of Hormuz insurable again? Because yesterday there was quite a bit of confusion about whether or not tankers had or had not been escorted up the Strait of Hormuz by the US Army.
Well, what will make it possible is a de-escalation of the conflict and security for vessels passing through. I'm very clear about that, and working closely with Gulf allies and also G7 allies to try and facilitate that.
And on de-escalation, obviously you're having discussions with G7 finance ministers. Would I have it right that actually there's a limited amount that finance ministers can do to de-escalate, and it sits with the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister, just picking away at what the Treasury can actually do to help de-escalate this conflict?
My primary role in all of this is to monitor and respond to the economic impacts, but of course working closely with my US counterpart, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and my European counterparts. We also have a role to play in ensuring, for example, that our defensive actions in the Middle East to defend our allies are properly funded. And as I said in the chamber on Monday, we've given the MOD access to the Special Reserve to be able to fund all additional deployments in the Middle East. That is part of my role, and of course, funding anything to ensure that vessels can flow more freely on the Strait of Hormuz, as well as advising on the release of strategic oil reserves.
There are two protagonists in this conflict, or three protagonists. One is the US and one is Iran. In the meetings with Scott Bessent that finance ministers have held, has it been made clear that the UK's position is that the US should return to the negotiating table and seek to de-escalate this conflict?
Yes, absolutely.
Just a question then, moving on to the state of the public finances. We have very high debt to GDP. There's already discussion about schemes to assist businesses and consumers with bills. But given our high debt to GDP, do we have the fiscal room to carry out something akin to what happened after Ukraine, which cost between 50 and 80 billion pounds?
We will always make sure that we do everything we can to protect consumers, but also to ensure our national security as an economy. We are in a stronger position than when I became Chancellor to respond to shocks like these, and we are in a stronger position in many ways than when Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. So inflation is on a downward path at the moment and is at a lower level than when Russia invaded Ukraine. In the spring forecast just over a week ago, the Office of Budget Responsibility confirmed that debt will be lower in every year of the forecast compared to the November forecast, and that we were meeting the fiscal rules both a year early, but also with additional headroom compared with the November forecasts. In addition, interest rates have come down 6 times over the last year, and the costs of government borrowing.
We're aware of those. We're talking particularly about Iran.
I suppose, Chancellor, what we had from witnesses recently is a sense that since the OBR was introduced, people have always promised tightening tomorrow, but whenever a crisis comes along, we spend money and then the tightening never occurs. What would be your response to that criticism?
Well, if you look at the deficit for this year, it is going to come in at 4.2% of GDP compared to 5.3% of GDP last year. So that fiscal consolidation is taking place now, not just projected to in the future. But the Office of Budget Responsibility also forecast that deficit will fall in every year of the forecast period. I think ending at about 1.6% of GDP in the final year, and it is the first time since I think 2019 that the deficit has been lower than 5%, and that's because of the actions that we took in my first 2 budgets, and it also reflects in this forecast lower costs of servicing that debt than in the autumn, and that reflects the stability that I've returned to the economy, which means that we are in a stronger position than we otherwise would have been to respond to a crisis like this. I'd just also say that the Office of Budget Responsibility, when they gave evidence to this committee yesterday, were clear that fiscal rules are medium-term rules. Now, our rules is that you the stability rule to pay for day-to-day spending through tax receipts and get debt down as a share of GDP in the moving to the 3rd year of the forecast, and that does, of course, as the OBR said yesterday, give scope for interventions in the short term. But I would also just say this: we are also in a stronger position in terms of the energy market than we were in 2022. In, I think, 2021, 90% of the time, energy prices depended on the marginal gas price. That's fallen by about a third since then. And the electricity that we buy using contracts for difference has also increased, I think, by 17%. And so the movements in global oil and gas prices have less of an effect, although still a big effect, on the prices paid for consumers for energy today than it was 5 years ago. And that shows the importance of moving away from volatile fossil fuel prices through investing in clean homegrown energy, so we are less reliant on those very volatile international markets and the vagaries of international events around the world.
Okay, and you mentioned on Monday that you're in regular contact with the Bank of England, and people coming to this committee do express concern about private markets and so on. Do you have any concerns about firm level or system level financial stability with all the volatility we're seeing in the different markets?
We monitor that closely, but markets are functioning in an orderly way at the moment. But obviously I'm in close contact with the Governor of the Bank of England and other MPC members and officials there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Grady. Luke Murphy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, everyone wants de-escalation, but we have to accept that this may be prolonged. In those circumstances, what preparation is underway in the Treasury for planning to support consumers and businesses with their energy bills?
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. First of all, I would like to think that everybody was in favour of de-escalation, but that's not been entirely clear during the short duration of this conflict to date. Both the Conservatives and Reform, when the conflict began just under 2 weeks ago, were suggesting that the UK should be engaged in offensive action against Iran in the Middle East. We made the decision that would be the wrong choice.
But the question was about preparation.
Yeah, well, the question was also about de-escalation. And the reason why is that one of the reasons why is because of the impact here in the UK. It was not in our national interest to be involved in that conflict, and that's why we made the decision that we did. But of course, the Treasury is always planning for different eventualities, and we saw the impact of higher oil and gas prices just a few years ago after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. But as the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, said in the Chamber on Monday, it is too soon to know the impact of this crisis and to take policy response. I'll also just say that the energy price cap does protect consumers, and in April the cut in energy bills will go ahead despite what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. And so on average, despite what's happening in the world, domestic energy bills will go down by £117 on the 1st of April, and that will last until the end of June.
Thank you for the answer. So too soon to take decisions, but not too soon to prepare. And I wondered whether you had any views on whether the government is better prepared or in a better place to offer more targeted support, energy bill support. The previous government had to offer quite broad-based support, costing £78 billion. What developments in policy have happened under this government to allow more targeted support, should it be necessary?
We're looking obviously at a whole range of different scenarios, but one reason why any future package, if it was necessary, will be more affordable is that we are now less reliant on international energy price movements than we were when Russia invaded Ukraine, because we've invested more in homegrown renewable energy, which is not subject to this price price volatility because it's purchased through contracts for difference. Now, over the next few years, we'll be more insulated as more of that renewable energy comes online, and as we build the infrastructure to better connect it to the grid, and that will be facilitated, of course, by the Planning and Infrastructure Act, which was passed at the end of last year. But even in the last 5 years, we have become less reliant on those international energy markets. That's not to downplay the significance in movements in global oil and gas prices, but the context is slightly different than it was when Russia invaded Ukraine.
The question on targeting, so I think just to return to that, is there work, or should the Treasury be beginning work with the Department for Energy Security to look at more targeted schemes to support consumers, even if it's planning and even if those decisions don't need to be made?
Yeah, of course we're working on different ways in which to protect people, including more targeted support. In the spending review last year, we expanded the warm homes discount to an additional 3 million lower income families as well. So in addition to the £150 on average that we took off people's bills from April this year, an additional 3 million households will get £150 on top of that, taking their total discount to £300, and that was targeted at the people who struggle most with their energy bills, those on the lowest incomes, both families and pensioners.
And finally, I asked this question in that the electricity generator levy, I believe, is set
Yes.
at £75 per megawatt hour. Do you believe that is set at the right level for it to be activated, or is that something that the Treasury should be looking at, and should it be potentially be considering whether it should be extended beyond 2027?
Well, both the Energy Profits Levy and the Electricity Generators Levy play an important role in stabilising the cost of any intervention, and both of those were set that they are only activated when prices are at an elevated level, and they were brought in by the previous Conservative government to ensure that those packages of support were perhaps a bit more affordable than they otherwise would have been by taxing those windfall profits. We're not at the moment looking at any changes to the electricity generators levy, but of course it will be activated in the circumstances that prices remain elevated.
Thank you.
Just a quick question from me, if I may. The electricity generator levy, of course, a lot more electricity now is fixed price under CFDs and the like, so presumably all other things being equal, it would raise less than it did before when there was more merchant capacity. And at the same time, we want to see more investment in the North Sea, arguably, and there's a lot of complaints about the taxes, for windfall taxes on oil and gas companies. They were critical to offsetting some of the costs of a preceding relief. So does this make any kind of form of wider scheme of relief more difficult, because those two offsets for it are maybe less strong than they were 4 years ago?
On the electricity generators levy, it goes to the point that I made earlier, that less of the price of our energy bill is determined by the marginal gas price than it was when Russia invaded Ukraine, which means that those prices will not go up in the same way that they would have done previously, because we're paying a set price for them. So that is welcome. It means that an increase in oil and gas prices would not have the same impact on domestic energy bills as it would have done just a few years ago, because of that investment in homegrown renewables and also the infrastructure to get that energy to people's homes. And both of those levies are set at a level that only taxes windfall profits. I would say that as well, that in the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast last week, they envisaged revenues from the energy profits levy going to zero in Q3 of next year, because they expected the oil and gas prices to fall below the floor. That shows the energy profits levy working, because as prices fall, revenue wouldn't be collected through that levy. Of course, if prices remain at an elevated level, revenue would come in, but of course that revenue would be needed to help with people's bills.
Thank you, Mr. Grady. Chancellor, you've talked about planning for all sorts of scenarios. Can you tell us precisely what planning is underway for businesses and for consumers?
Well, already, given the unique situation with heating oil, we are working with the Competition and Markets Authority on any price gouging in that sector.
Is price gouging the main concern you have there?
No, I mean the main concern and the main response is to try and de-escalate the crisis, because that's the main reason why prices are at elevated levels. But I've made that point on how important that is, and to get vessels flowing. But we have already started work with the Competition and Markets Authority.
So that's for home heating oil. What about other consumers?
Yeah, so another route into the cost of living is through petrol and diesel prices at the pumps. And we have started using the cheaper fuel finder that the government have been working on for the last few months. And as I said in the House yesterday, at the beginning of this week, there was a range in prices between just under 130p to 180p per litre. And tomorrow I'll be meeting with the Competition and Markets Authority.
So the CMA, so you're talking to the CMA?
And also directly with petrol retailers, and myself and the Secretary of State for Energy and Net Zero will be meeting with them tomorrow.
What about planning for longer term reliefs? Obviously the summer, when the cap lifts, will be an easier period, but towards the winter, what precisely are you looking at in terms of options and for both businesses and consumers in terms of their day-to-day use of energy?
On businesses, it's also worth noting that the extension of the supercharger comes in at the beginning of April, and that increases the discount for the most energy-intensive industries from 60% to 90%. That was planned anyway, and that will come in. We're also working with the Department for Business and Trade on the business, the British Industry Competitiveness Scheme, which comes in next April, to ensure that helps in the right way the industries that most need that support. So there is other work going on in terms of business support in both my department and also in DESNES and in DBT. Look, nothing is off the table at this stage. We are looking, as Mr. Murphy suggested, targeted support as well as broader measures, but it is just too early to say.
So on the targeted, I mean, one of the issues picked up yesterday, but we know this from previous schemes, is having the data available to target properly, that often the blanket approaches were easier, even though it was dead weight. And so what progress has been made on data sharing across government with HMRC and others? I mean, the Treasury has huge power here. How are you wielding that power?
Look, Mr. Glenn was in the department when Russia invaded Ukraine, and a lot of this work started then. But as you rightly suggest, Dame Meg, it didn't progress, and it hadn't been further enough advanced to be able to have more targeted support. But I know that was something that was looked at by the previous government. To be honest, the fact that work took place then means that we are more advanced on this occasion. So I thank previous ministers and officials for starting that piece of work, which makes it more likely to be able to use targeted support this time. So we're looking at all of those things, but it's too early to give you different scenarios and different options in different scenarios.
Okay. Dame Harriet.
Thank you, Chancellor. Many of my rural constituents, often pensioners, rely on heating oil, and they're looking at £1,000 extra to fill up their tank this week. Some of that may be price gouging, but it's mainly the price. So is your advice to them to just wait until things have de-escalated to fill up their tank if they're very low?
Well, I know for some people that's not an option if they are out of heating oil, which is why we are working very rapidly with the Competition and Markets Authority and on a range of issues. And my colleague, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, has already had a number of meetings in the last couple of days that is meeting MPs, and I would just encourage people whose constituents do use heating oil to attend that meeting today. But we know that there are bad practices, for example, of...
It's not just bad practice, though, it's the increase in the price, isn't it?
Yeah, sure, but let me give you a couple of examples. So, for example, some companies are saying that you can only buy a larger quantity. They won't sell in small quantities, whereas at the moment, many people want to top up a little bit at the higher price, but not fill up their whole tank. So we're looking at some of those market practices, which aren't necessarily about price, but they're also about quantity. But we've been using the last few days to properly understand what is happening in that market. And after the meeting today, we will make decisions on what further action is needed. But I would encourage you to feed in your examples, because that is so helpful in designing policy.
I definitely will do that. But what I'm hearing is your advice is, if you really need to, top up a little bit, otherwise just try and hang on. Thank you, Chair.
And I would say to businesses providing heating oil that it is not right to say that you will only sell in large quantities at the moment. That's not fair on customers. And I would encourage consumers to push back and to shop around in circumstances where they're being told they can only buy a large quantity at a very high price.
Thank you. Chancellor, thank you for that. I mean, if you could perhaps give a sentence summary. You have to plan for the very worst, because the government's got to be there to manage these risks. So what's your message to the British public about if the de-escalation doesn't work and we're still in a situation in the autumn coming into the winter when this will really hit households hard?
What I would say is that we are much too early, less than 2 weeks into the conflict, to have any certainty about what things would look like when the next energy price cap is determined at the end of May for July. And we will work flat out to try and de-escalate this conflict, and crucially, from an economic perspective, to get vessels moving again in the Strait of Hormuz. But myself and the Prime Minister have been very clear, and I would encourage people to judge us on our actions around tackling the cost of living challenges that people face, and whether it's the £150 off of bills from April, the freeze in prescription charges, the freeze in rail fares. We recognise that for too many people the cost of living is still a real day-to-day challenge, and we will do everything we can to support.
So are you able to just say we are making plans if there are?
As I've already confirmed, we're looking at all eventualities, but the root cause of this is the challenge in getting oil and gas out of the Middle East, and so the best way to deal with this is to address that at core, at the root.
Great. Chancellor, could we turn to growth? You're 20 months into a 5-year, so a third the way through this term. You've talked about the National Wealth Fund, planning reform, a new industrial strategy as some of the things that you've done to drive growth. But if we look at some of the OBR's assessments, obviously there's been an upgrade, a modest one, very modest one for the next 2 years, and a downgrade for this year. One of the issues that is around the cost of employment and the cost of energy, which is actually putting a real impact on unemployment. How would you now, a third the way into this Parliament, characterise your progress on your growth mission, and what do you think are the sort of main policies that are going to deal with those pressures on employment?
Yeah. So last year we were the fastest growing European country in the G7, and that's also forecast to be the case this year. But the truth is, growth both here and around the world, especially in advanced economies, is not as strong as we would like it to be, which is why I've always said that growth is the number one mission of this government. And obviously growth and the cost of living are closely intertwined, because the cost of living is always higher if your wages are not keeping up with higher prices. Now, the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast that the average person would be £1,000 better off by the end of this Parliament than they were at the start. That's a huge improvement compared with the last Parliament, where people were worse off on average at the end than they were at the start. But I'm under absolute no illusions that there's more to do, both to grow the economy and to ensure that people feel in all parts of the country the benefits of that growth. And there's a number of things coming in this year that I am confident will have a positive impact. So, for example, the Planning and Infrastructure Act that I mentioned earlier only got royal assent at the end of last year. That now comes into effect and will make it cheaper and quicker to build vital infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, and particularly the infrastructure that will get the energy from the projects, whether that is offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, to people's homes. That comes in. The Planning and Infrastructure Act is now in force and is making it easier to get those things built, as well as things like digital infrastructure and data centres, house building, which is obviously crucial, and transport infrastructure as well. A number of other things also come in this year. So the Pension Schemes Bill is currently working its way through Parliament at the moment. If that gets royal assent in the second quarter of this year, that will free up more money for investment in private assets, both venture capital and infrastructure.
Can I just interject there briefly? I don't think anyone would dispute the potential for those things to make a meaningful difference. But I think we have got to address the immediate context that the country faces at the moment in terms of the cost of employing people and what that is actually, what behaviours we're seeing on the ground. We've seen the OBR talk about the higher labour costs, and I think energy costs for small business, even if there's a plan to reduce them over time, are materially impacting growth in this year. And I acknowledge, be straight and fair on these matters, but the growth trajectory for this year is significantly down. Do you not think that interventions to deal with that problem in the labour market, with unemployment rising up, particularly for young people, is something that needs a more urgent intervention than some of those medium-term measures you've alighted on?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they were medium-term measures because they're things that are coming in this year. But let me address employment and then energy. The Youth Guarantee scheme that I announced in the budget last year comes in the next couple of months, including the job guarantee for young people who have been out of education, employment or training for 18 months. We're also tilting the apprenticeship scheme so that there are more apprenticeship opportunities for young people, because many of the apprenticeships, and there has been a fall in apprenticeships, but many of the apprenticeships are increasingly offered to older workers, and of course we want people to be able to reskill, but we do want the apprenticeships to particularly benefit younger people. So do recognise some of those challenges, which is why we are doing something about it. We did make the decision to increase national insurance in my first budget, and that's because we needed to properly fund public services, including the National Health Service, which got a £29 billion a year uplift. And so I do recognise, and it's a valid argument to say that that should not have happened. But if that didn't happen, we wouldn't have been able to put the money into the NHS and reduce waiting lists. And reducing waiting lists in the NHS is also good for business because it means that more people are available for work and the workforce is healthier. But I do recognise there are particular issues around youth unemployment. A lot of that, with respect, we inherited with a big increase in the young people not in education, employment or training. But we are facing into that with actions coming on stream from next month. Let me also say something about energy costs. The supercharger was something introduced by the previous government. What we're doing is we are increasing the generosity of it. So at the moment it provides a discount for around 500 businesses of 60%. and we're extending that to 90%, and that happens from April this year. But we do recognise that there are many other businesses outside of those 500 who also face high bills and are energy intensive. And so what we are introducing from next April is this new scheme which benefits around 7,000 businesses, focusing on the foundational sectors of the economy and also the industrial strategy sectors. Now, if you say, would you like to bring that in sooner? Yes, absolutely I would.
Well, no, I'm not going to say that.
Well, I say it regularly.
You
we have to design the scheme and make sure it functions properly.
Chancellor, what I'm trying to get at is we've got 5.5 million, I think, small businesses who say the combination of the national insurance increases, the double the rate of inflation broadly increases in national living the uncertainty over the effect, given the OBR said to us yesterday they can't score the effect of the Employment Rights Act because there's consultations outstanding. That gives a completely different context for all of those small businesses around whether they will employ somebody. And if you look at the youth unemployment at over 16%, I think it's higher than the average in the EU, it feels like what you're talking about has theoretically a macroeconomic effect over time, but in the short term, the OBR and most surveys are saying, confidence in employing people is just not there. Do you think your measures are the right ones to actually move the dial in the immediate term?
Well, if you look at the OBR forecast and the things that they have taken into account, they've taken into account, for example, our increase in capital spending, and say that will have a positive impact on the size of the economy. And they've taken into account some of our planning reforms and say that they have had a positive impact on the size of the economy. They have not scored negatively the Employment Rights Act.
Well, it's hardly likely to be positive. Is it?
Apart from it gives people greater security. So if you know that you'll get sick pay from day one, that means you have a bit more confidence to spend the money that you have.
What does it do for an employer who's anxious?
Well, no, because I think you have to look at these things in the round, because if you are a worker on a 0-hour contract and you don't know next week how many hours you're going to get, it is very difficult to be able to plan anything for the future, and very difficult to spend because you have to build up precautionary savings because you're not sure if you're going to be working the next week.
The question I'm asking is, if the propensity to employ somebody is less, that is a theoretical construct because the person won't be in a job in the first place. Are you saying that you are committed to a higher cost labour and higher capital investment growth strategy? Is that a fair summary of where your measures are taking us?
I think you have to take into account the impact that it will have on employees as consumers. And if you've got more money in your pocket, that's more money to spend on your local high street and in your local business. Now, this argument played out when the last Labour government introduced the national minimum wage in the first place. And there was representations from business and other political parties that said the national minimum wage would cost jobs. It didn't. Employment
It's nearly 30
increased.
years ago. We have seen youth unemployment at record levels now in these first 20 months of your government.
Well, with respect, Mr Glenn, we saw the number of people not in education, employment or training under the last Conservative government increase by more than 100,000. That was not because of greater protections at work and increases in their wages. In fact, living standards went backwards in the last Parliament. So I just don't accept the premise of your question. But is the argument, do I think that working people should have more money in their pockets to spend in the way that they choose and have security from going out to work? Absolutely, I do. And do I think that would be good for the economy? I do.
Yeah, I'm just not clear what you think is going to get those people into employment in the first place. It's going to persuade employers, given the context that now exists for them, to make the decision to employ people.
There are more people in employment than they were when Labour came into office, and partly that reflects a reduction in the inactivity rate. So I think there's only been 3 years in the last 50 years where the employment rate has been higher than it is today. And it is, of course, welcome that people are putting themselves forward for work, and that will reflect a number of things like better childcare, for example. Greater security at work encourages more people to take a job as well. So you have a situation where, yes, unemployment has increased a little bit, but so has inactivity has also reduced. And as a result, the number of people actually in work today is higher than when we came into office.
Thank you. Mr Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just on this point of the employment rise, isn't there an argument that actually this will lead to more productive employees? Because there's a lot of evidence that shows that greater security will lead to more productive employees, which is actually better for business. I mean, is that part of the theory of growth as well?
I don't believe in a sort of trickle-down economic theory of growth where you make better off people a bit better off, and eventually that affects the ordinary person in your Basingstoke constituency or my Leeds West and Pudsey constituency. I believe that growth comes from the bottom up and the middle out, and that if working people, who are the vast majority, have a bit more security and a bit more money in their pockets, then the economy would be stronger. The reason the economy has been weak for the last few years is that living standards have gone backwards, which meant people, after paying their rent or their mortgage and their bills and the weekly food shop, had very little money left to spend on other things, and that's not good for businesses, particularly high street businesses and small businesses. And that is what we are trying to turn around, not just growth for growth's sake, but growth that actually is felt in the pockets of working people and makes working people better off, and also growth in all parts of the country. And it has been the case that for too long the government has relied on too small a part of the country and too few industries, and that has not delivered the balanced growth which has benefited people in all parts of the country. And that's why you've got such high levels of both regional inequality and absolute inequality.
Thank you, Chancellor. In fact, when I asked a question in the House on the statement on this issue, you were quite passionate about growth across every part of the UK, and you obviously talk about growth all the time. You're challenged, obviously, especially in the current climate. But how can you just espouse your vision for delivering that growth in every area of the UK? What will that feel like? I remember back in 2011 being on the doorstep in Pudsey. A woman in a lovely semi-detached house, a car in the driveway. Her husband had gone down to a 4-day week, but she was pleased that he still had the job. She was in a part-time job so she could spend time with the children. She just wanted them to get a good education, and had a parent with health problems. The classic family. I often think of that woman that I had that conversation with. How is she going to benefit, and how are you going to deliver that growth in this term of Parliament? What will be delivered by the end of this Parliament? Give us your passionate vision for this, because we want to see where your passion is, Chancellor. Thank you very much for that story. And I think probably all of us will have in our mind, somebody we've met. I remember meeting a woman a long way from my constituency down on the south coast in Worthing, and between her and her husband, I think they had 5 or 6 jobs. They had a young child that lived in private rented accommodation, and the woman said to me, "I just wonder whether we're doing something wrong." And that stuck with me for a long time, because her and her husband were doing everything right, but the economy wasn't working for her and her family. And this idea that every generation does better than the last, for her, that just didn't feel like the case, and she was worried that for her young child that wouldn't be the case for What are you saying to her now about what your plans will deliver, or you hope?
So look, we've got to grow the economy. That's why it's the number one mission of this government. But it's got to be felt in the pockets of ordinary people in Worthing, in Hackney, in Leeds West and Pudsey, in all parts of the country. And that means more good jobs, paying decent wages that you can afford to raise a family on. So that is the vision. That is what I want to see. How are we going to go about it? My economic strategy is based on stability, investment and reform. So stability, which brings down interest rates and gets inflation low and stable, and government borrowing costs down, so we have more money money to spend on the things that actually matter, like a good education and good hospitals, rather than paying £100 billion a year on just debt interest costs. So stability is the first plank, then investment, and that is a combination of public and private. And I believe in a strategic and active state that gets involved, doesn't just step back, but steps up and works with businesses to unlock opportunities. And there's massive opportunities at the moment in areas where the UK is really good, in life sciences, in new technologies, in defence industries. But that requires a government that doesn't just sort of say, oh, well, we'll leave energy costs to the market, or that says, it doesn't really matter where things are made or who makes them, just that we can use these technologies. Well, I think it does profoundly matter where things are made and who makes them, and I want the jobs and I want the opportunities here in Britain. So a combination of the higher capital spending that I was able to unlock because of my fiscal rules, the creation and the better funding for the public financed institutions, whether that's UK Export Finance, the British Business Bank, or the National Wealth Fund, and then leveraging in that private sector investment. And one of the success stories over the last 18 months is that investment in the UK, public and private, has been higher than all but one G7 economy. It is the first time in a long time that we could say that, because it has been our investment performance which has been particularly weak, which contributes to the weaker productivity growth that we've seen. And then the final plank of my sort of strategy is around reform, and that is taking out those barriers that are prohibiting businesses from investing. That's why the planning reform, the regulatory reform, the pensions and capital markets reform, the trade deals that we're doing are all so important to unlocking that growth and potential, and encouraging businesses to increase what they invest in the UK, whether that's a scale-up business that's deciding whether to stay here or not, or a multinational deciding whether to invest in Britain or a different country around the world, or the small high street business that's thinking about taking on another worker or opening a new shop. So, the vision is working people in all parts of the country better off, and the way to get there is through stability, investment, and reform of how the economy works.
From what you said, you don't mind having an interventionist approach at times, for example, on energy prices. That's part of your strategy too.
No, it's absolutely part of the strategy. It's a partnership approach between government and business. There are some things that that business can't do. Businesses do not fund the basic R&D. They don't fund the universities or the skills or the health service, which makes sure we've got
where business
a healthy
won't go,
workforce.
the government, you're saying government will to pump prime.
Well, it's not just pump prime, it's providing some of those basic services, but also things like Northern Powerhouse Rail or the Oxcam corridor. There is a role of government in making sure the infrastructure is in place to connect people and jobs, to build the housing, to make sure that you've got the reservoirs, that you've got the energy infrastructure going to the right places. But there's things that government can't do. We're not going to innovate in life sciences or in defence. We've got brilliant industry, brilliant businesses to do those things, and great new businesses emerging as well. But it's up to government to partner with those businesses to unlock the potential.
Thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, you just mentioned about the potential for the private and public sectors to work together. I recently guested on a PAC committee where they looked at the public-private partnerships in delivering social infrastructure in the past and the lessons that can be learned from that. Is that something that the government will look to do again, learn the lessons of the past public-private partnership investments in social infrastructure in schools and hospitals, and start to look at that model again?
I think it is easier to do those sorts of models where there is an income stream than in areas where there isn't. I think there is some role, and in the NHS in primary care, the health sector is looking at some options there. But in other areas, like, for example, the Lower Thames Crossing, that will be primarily privately funded. Similarly, the investment in Sizewell C as a sort of consortium, including the government, but also including Centrica, one of the Canadian energy pension funds, and EDF, the French energy company.
Those are the more obvious places to put
yes,
it.
They are more obvious places.
But the hospitals programme, for example, lots of people in a long queue, NHS Confederation saying, actually, maybe we need to look at PPP again. Obviously, there's some political scarring from how it went in the past, but are you open-minded to that?
I'm open-minded, but we have absolutely got to learn the lessons from the past. And Department for Health have come up with some proposals around primary care. We're interested in working with them on those, but we are primarily pursuing that approach in areas where there is a clear income stream and where private expertise is particularly valuable.
Thank you very much, Ms Lee. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, at the last budget you made a significant investment in special educational needs of £4 billion per year, and you faced many different competing pressures from various departments. I was wondering if you could outline why you chose SEND as a particular focus for investment, why that was a particular priority for you, and also whether the picture of the impact of that spending on other departments has become clearer since the autumn budget.
So the Department for Education have been working for a while on reform through the schools white paper, including for children with special educational needs. And every week in Parliament, whether it's Prime Minister's questions or something else, and every week in all of our surgeries, we will have parents coming to see us. And whenever we visit a school, teachers talking to us about the serious problems in special educational needs. When I was little, my mum was a special needs teacher, and so I know through my family experience how important this is, and also as a mum, I know how important it is that that children with special needs have the right provision, ideally in mainstream schools, and that schools are better equipped for supporting children with a whole range of needs in a way that's just not happening today. And the system today has become incredibly adversarial as well, where you have to fight, and that's the language that people use to get an EHCP, rather than just rely on the school to support your child with whatever needs that they have. And so I welcome the work that the Education Secretary and the Schools Minister have done to consult with parents and young people and schools to come up with these plans. Now, without action, what would happen is what we've done this year, which is that we help fund councils who have got into debt because of special educational needs. And what we're doing is creating a more resilient system where we are actually funding those needs rather than having to step in at the end of the year to top up the funding of local authorities. And so in the spring forecast, we fully funded what was set out in the schools white paper, and I was pleased that we were able to do that. I think that this is something I think that unites people across all political parties and all parents, that something needs to be done in this area, and I think the approach set out is the right one.
Ms Yang.
Thank you, and I think we've seen those pressures from parents in our own constituencies as well, definitely.
Yes, yeah.
How will the impact of that spending be spread among other departmental budgets? Will there be will it be equally spread, or how will it be distributed?
No, we've now funded it in the spring forecast, so that's in addition to funding previously allocated.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Mr Dixon.
Thank you, Jane Meg. So absolutely the additional funding to fund the proposals in the white paper, which I think most people would regard as a big step forward, as you say, providing for the needs of special educational needs pupils in the school with well-resourced teaching and facilities in the school. Have you, however, thought about whether that £4 billion additional investment is enough? There is some indication that it could be the case that people bring forward, for instance, their requirement for an EHCP for a child who requires support ahead of the 2028 and 2030 deadlines for EHCPs to be allocated differently, and that will actually create extra demand in the system, which the extra £4 billion won't be able to cope with.
Chancellor.
Look, it's not. It wasn't my job to work out what the funding need was. That's the policy is for Department for Education to work through. But we made a decision as a government to fund this fully, based on the money that the Department for Education felt was needed to fully fund it. What I would say to parents is, this has been widely consulted on, and we want to build a better system, not a worse system. And what most parents and what most young people and what most schools want is for not people to have to fight to get the support that they need, but to get the support that they need, and for mainstream schools to be properly funded, with teachers properly trained to address needs in the classroom rather than through specialist provision, often a long way away. And part of what we've been doing, including the higher capital budgets that I've been able to set out, is funding for mainstream schools and in local communities to have better provision rather than young people having to travel long distances to access the education that they need and deserve. And so this reform is about moving to a better system, not making it harder for parents or children or schools to get the support that they need.
Just one quick follow-up. So in 29-30, there's a requirement for the departments to fund something like £5.6 billion worth of SEND requirement, and that in turn has given you £5.6 billion extra headroom in the overall budgets. Is that just a sort of accounting sleight of hand? To increase
no, but maybe I'll let Dharmesh explain.
No, the funding that we provided for SEND was additional funding over and above what was set out at the spending review. The impacts of that are in the spring forecast. The change that happened in the autumn that the Chancellor set out was that this fund, the sort of burden of this has been on local authorities who have been accumulating debts over time, much of which we've now written off. But the funding for the Department for Education is funding to the Department for Education, which we've accounted for in the spring forecast.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dixon. You and Young MP.
Thank you, Chair. Turning to the other side of spending, to taxation, you've taken measures to narrow the gap between the way that wealth is taxed and the way that work is taxed, for example, at the last budget. Looking out over the remainder of this Parliament, do you think there is more to be done on narrowing that gap?
So it took a number of measures, particularly in the first budget, but also in the second budget, to ensure that those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share of tax. So we've got rid of the non-dom tax status entirely. We increased the rate of capital gains tax. We got rid of the loophole whereby private equity bonuses were being treated as capital gains rather than income, VAT and business rates on private school fees, and increasing the taxes on private jets. In the budget last year, in addition to that, we introduced the higher value council tax charge, which will come in a couple of years' time for properties worth more than £2 million. So those are all highly progressive measures, and you can see that in all of the distributional analysis that the Treasury and others have done. We've done the things that we want to do as a government, but obviously we always keep these under a review. So the other thing I should say that we've done, which has been very successful and I think very welcomed, is that we are now collecting more of the tax that is due. And that is because the sterling work, to be honest, of my Chief Secretary to the Treasury when he was the Exchequer Secretary, and the new Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, working with the excellent team at HMRC to crack down on tax avoidance and tax evasion. And we're now putting a lot more resource into that, which so far has had very positive effects.
Thank you. And speaking of tax evasion as well, there was a manifesto commitment to end the loopholes in the treatment of offshore trusts. I was wondering if you could speak to the progress on that particular commitment.
Yes, so a lot of that is also regard to the treatment of non-dom taxation. And so there was a worry that people would you find loopholes to avoid the changes in the non-dom tax regime, but trusts have been incorporated into that. That's one example.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. John Gale, MP.
Yeah, could I ask a question about the overall tax burden? You've got a 10 billion further increase in the last year of the Parliament. People are seeing that the level of tax overall is heading up to 50% of GDP. Do you have a view about what effect that has on the motivation of people to work, to invest, and is there any sort of upper limit that you would have on tax?
The Chancellor's job is to get the balance right between public spending, taxation and borrowing. And I've been really clear that to return stability to the economy, we cannot continue to borrow at the levels that I inherited. And so the result of the actions I've taken, whether that is spending restraint or indeed the tax increases, has taken the budget deficit from 5.3% to 4.2% of GDP. And borrowing was masking a problem that we had in the previous Parliament, where the deficit was never lower than 5% of GDP, and that's just not sustainable. And if you're borrowing now, you are basically taxing more in the future, and that is what has now caught up with us, which is why we made those decisions to increase taxes to stabilise the public finances, but also to properly fund public spending.
What assessment does you make and your officials make regarding the effect on economic activity of taxation? I mean, you arguably made quite a delicate judgment on capital gains tax and stuff to do with the city, but the overall tax burden, does have an impact in terms of people when they look at the UK. Do you recognise that, and what would you say to that point?
Absolutely, and when we looked at capital gains tax, we looked at the rate that would maximise revenue, and obviously if you go beyond a certain rate on taxes, it does have an impact on people's marginal propensity to work. I don't think we are at those levels, but of course when we score any policies, when we look at the impact of any policies, we look at those policies in the round, including any negative effects, and also we have the Office of Budget Responsibility to help us with that, who will in the end make their judgments about the impact of policy.
I mean, yesterday the OBR confirmed that when you've taken account of the commitment you've made on defence 3% and the SEND investment, the average spending on health, if you look at the unprotected departments in the last year of the Parliament, there'll be a 13 billion gap, 4.4% cut in spending across this block. Now obviously the future spending reviews will look at that, but I mean that implies that if you don't find extraordinary levels of efficiency that we haven't seen before, that you're going to have to either raise more taxes other than those already planned, or you're going to have cuts in spending in those unprotected departments. I mean, that's a fact. The OBR have said that. Those unprotected departments will see a 4.4%. How do you respond to that?
I'll say a couple of things in response to that. First of all, we set out ambitious targets for efficiencies in public services. And we are also through higher capital investment, and often these numbers about unprotected departments just looks at RDEL rather than TDEL, and obviously capital spending is also an important element of spending, which can also reduce some of the day-to-day costs if you've got better infrastructure and particularly better technologies. So we are improving the efficiency of public services as well. Over the course of this Parliament, I think we're spending £50 billion a year extra on day-to-day spending by the end of the Parliament, and over the course of the Parliament £120 billion more on capital spending. So although the growth is lower in the final years, that was after uplifts in earlier years. So overall there's a lot more spending than we inherited. But in the end, the best way to be able to afford the public services we want without having to increase taxes is through growing the economy and also reducing the costs of debt servicing. You know, Mr. Glenn, that we spend £100 billion a year.
6 billion, yeah.
Pardon?
106 billion.
Yeah, on just debt interest. Now, in the spring forecast, the OBR said that the cost of servicing debt this year would be £3 billion lower than they forecast just in November, because the costs of government interest on government borrowing had fallen. And the prize, if we can get our borrowing costs back to the G7 average, is £15 billion every year less debt interest costs, which is why returning stability to the economy is so important to me. But it's one of the reasons why economic growth is so important as well, because if you can grow the economy, you have more money for public services or to reduce taxes.
I just have one last question on fuel duty. You've postponed that removal of the freeze until September. I think we've had 15 years of freeze. You will talk about, as you did yesterday, what you inherited and that deferred choice, but it wasn't in any finance bill. In the context, obviously, governments respond to events. Given the uncertainty that are obviously live at the moment and people looking for reassurance over those cost of living pressures, is there any prospect at all that you will look at the fuel duty and its effect on people in rural areas particularly, and whether that needs to be looked at again?
It is too early to know where petrol prices are going to be in September. On Monday, oil and gas prices rose sharply. Yesterday, they fell sharply, and so things are moving on a daily basis at the moment. But one of the things I'm absolutely convinced of is that when oil and gas prices fall, they're not always passed on to consumers, which is why we have just started using the cheaper fuel finder that the government has been working on.
No, we've listened carefully to the measures and activities that you set out yesterday and again this morning. My question is simple. Do you rule out addressing the fuel duty at all?
Well, governments always keep all taxes under review, as you know.
So it's possible that you could address
We
it.
always keep all taxes under review, but it is much too early when those changes are not due to come into effect until September to guess where petrol prices will be then. But I'm very loath to spend government money on something that the market should be doing itself, and that's why greater competition and greater transparency about pricing is so important. I would rather we had a properly functioning market where customers have decent information about prices at different petrol forecourts, rather than subsidising the money, which often actually just goes to the retailer.
I don't dispute that. Having worked, as you know, under 4 chancellors, I recognise the difference between the theory where we'd like to be and the political reality of where we are. And, I would just put it to you that, what we're actually seeing at the moment might necessitate an action that might not be desirable, as it wasn't in 2020 to spend $363 billion over the next 2 years. But circumstances meant that we had to.
Well, you said all things on the table.
Just specifically on the timing of that, Chancellor, if I may, my understanding is you only want to do one fiscal event a year, and the increase in petrol prices starts in September. So are you telling us this morning that if petrol prices are a lot higher in September, that you'll make an announcement then, or are you committed to going ahead and increasing the cost of living for drivers on the 1st of September as planned?
As former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said in the Chamber on Monday, it is much too soon to be speculating about what action is going to be needed.
You wouldn't rule out coming in September?
It's much too soon to start speculating.
Right, let's try another one, if I may, Chair.
We just say the Parliament sits back again, I think, on the 1st of September, so there's some technical issues that we'll have to resolve here soon. Harriet Morgan.
The windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas. I think you had a meeting with the industry the day after the war. Can you update us on what you told them about the potential for that windfall tax to be relaxed? Because I think that is what you're aiming to do, and what the timing might be.
Well, the Office of Budget Responsibility, in their current forecast, do expect it to not apply from Q3 next year. And I think, as David Miles and Tom Joseph said to the committee yesterday, if this de-escalates, there is no reason why the forecast, might not be correct for next year. In which case, the Energy Profits Levy falls away, and that is always the way that the previous government and this government wanted the Energy Profits Levy to work, to only be in operation when prices were high. But I spoke to the energy companies about a range of things last week. Obviously, some UK-based energy companies also have operations around the world, including in the Middle East, and so we wanted to hear directly from them about what we could do to unlock travel in the Strait of Hormuz. Also wanted to talk about opportunities to expand production under different scenarios in the North Sea to bring more oil and gas on stream. So we discussed a range of things next week. I'm very clear, and so is this government, that oil and gas, including North Sea oil and gas, will continue to play a really important role in our energy mix for many decades to come, and we want to work with the industry.
And then finally on pensioners, because the Office for Budget Responsibility says that about 1 million more pensioners are going to be drawn into paying income tax over the forecast period, and many of those pensioners will rely exclusively on the state pension. And I think you've said publicly that you're going to find a way for them not to pay income tax. Can you tell us how that's going to work operationally?
Yep. So from the beginning of April, the new state pension is going to go up by £575 a year, and over the course of this Parliament, it's forecast that the new state pension will be £2,000 a year higher by the end of the forecast because of this government's commitment to the triple lock. Now, the previous government froze the income tax thresholds, and in those years, for those freezes, is when the new state pension will come into income tax if nothing is done. But I have committed to do something. We are working on how that will work at the moment, but we've been clear that if your only income is from the new state pension, you will not be subject to income tax during the course of this Parliament, and we'll set out details later this year on how that will happen.
Okay, thank you.
So, but if you earned a small amount of bank interest, or say you earned above the £500,000 threshold, or you had a small dividend, you would be subject to income tax.
It's already the case that that most pensioners with any form of private income are taxed. We want to, of course, make that as simple as possible. But for the course of this Parliament, when we are in office, we will not be taxing people whose only income is from the new state pension.
Okay, well, we'll see more to delve into there.
Yes, and we've got to make sure that we have a system that works, but we are
and it's fair,
to do
and it's
that.
fair to pensioners who are at the margin as well, because there's a potential cliff edge, isn't there? Thank you. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, firstly, thank you for what you've done for all special educational needs. But moving on to defence, if we send ground troops to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, like all reservist soldiers, I'm at risk to serve. British soldiers were killed in Afghanistan in part because previous governments failed to properly fund defence. One of them was one of my best friends, Captain David Hicks, MC. What are you doing to ensure that this government doesn't make the same mistake?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I remember previously at this select committee you talking about your constituent and special educational needs, and I thank you for sharing that story. And it is the sort of stories that we hear from our constituents, because as well as being, in my case, Chancellor of the Exchequer, I am also a constituency MP and somebody who uses public services, and we see the impacts that failing services have on all of our constituents and also on our own families. So thank you for raising your experience and also your experience about your friend in Afghanistan. It is important that we learn lessons from the past, and one of the reasons why we chose not to be involved in the US action a week and a half ago was because of some of those lessons from the past, and I think it is important to be cognizant of those lessons when we are asked to take military action. In terms of Ukraine, we would only be part of peacekeeping. It would only be after a ceasefire was agreed, and obviously we are working with allies as part of a coalition of the willing on what that would look like in reality. We have committed £3 billion a year for as long as it takes to support the people of Ukraine, and if there is a ceasefire, which we all hope there is, we would divert those resources in the appropriate way.
Thank you. You've mentioned former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt quite a lot today. He, of course, called for defence to increase to 3% of GDP in the Chamber on Monday. He didn't do it himself. We heard yesterday...
Different then.
Always.
we heard yesterday from economists that, in fact, if you strip out the risk-free rate, UK gilt yields are actually in line with the G7 average, and the UK has actually the second lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7 right now. So what is holding you back from increasing defence to 3% of GDP now, given that it fits entirely in with your economic vision?
Can I just add with my colleague, is hindsight a wonderful thing?
Okay, yes. Chancellor.
I agree with Dame Siobhan, as ever.
Always wise.
Always wise, exactly. Look, obviously, I want to, paint a rosy picture about the public finances, but I'm not sanguine about them. If you take out inflation, it may be the case that we have a lower real rate of interest. But you can't take out inflation because you have to pay for inflation as well. And inflation in Britain has been too high. It rose to more than 11% in the previous Parliament. It's down to 3% now. It's forecast to come down quite sharply, including because of the measures that we took in the budget, which take 0.4 percentage points off of inflation. But we all recognise that if there is a protracted conflict in the Middle East, that's unlikely to be realised, as I think Tom and David set out to your committee yesterday.
Tom and David, members of the Budget Responsibility Committee, just for us.
As I set out to your committee yesterday. So we do have to be mindful of both the public finances but also family finances, because everything else being equal, if government spends more, then there's more demand pressure in the economy that pushes up inflation higher. Now, I'm really proud to be the Chancellor that has given the biggest uplift to defence spending since the end of the Cold War. It will be at 2.6% of GDP by April next year. In the manifesto of political parties at the last election, the Conservatives said that they would take it to 2.5% by the end of the Parliament, and we're getting there in 2027. And that's fully funded by a commensurate reduction in the overseas development assistance budget. That was the right thing to do, although a difficult decision, the right thing to do given the threats and challenges that we face. And we've also made that commitment to get to 3%.
We're aware. Thank you.
But we'll set that out
Mr.
in the future.
Coglan.
Thank you. Has the UK accepted an invitation from Prime Minister Carney to participate in the charter negotiations for the Defence, Security and Resilience Bank? And if not, what's holding you back?
Well, there are a number of options on the table being discussed by allies, including with Canada, about a multilateral approach to do a number of things around defence lending and procurement. We're very active in those conversations.
Of course, the UK is the third highest defence spender in NATO, but our defence capability and output would suggest the opposite. Where do you think the MOD has got this wrong?
the MOD and the people who work in the MOD and the people who work in our armed forces do an absolutely amazing job and work hard every single day to keep our country safe. There have obviously been problems with big contracts and overruns and cost overruns and time delays, but also every country in the world is updating how they spend money on defence, in part because of the lessons from how Ukraine has used its money on much greater innovation with new technologies, and defence spending needs to adjust to the new reality, the new modern methods of warfare, where technology is obviously going to play an increasing part.
And is a defence investment plan on your desk?
The Defence Investment Plan is on the MOD's desk. As I said, we've given the biggest uplift in spending since the end of the Cold War, but things are changing rapidly, as I said in my previous answer, in defence, and making sure that we spend that money wisely is obviously incredibly important. Learning lessons from how Ukraine has conducted its operations means that we need to constantly look at how we spend our money to best possible use.
So just to be clear, the Defence Investment Plan, which was going to be out last autumn, is still with the Ministry of Defence? It hasn't come to you for approval at this point? Well,
there's obviously discussions going on in government, but we have provided the allocation of funding agreed with the MOD and the Secretary of State in the spending review last year.
There's some speculation that there's a well, it's always going to be a tension between the Treasury and the MOD on one level, but that is being blocked by the Treasury at this point. Is that? Can you just either say that's true or put that rumour to bed?
Well, we've provided allocations for every government department.
Yeah.
Obviously, every government department would like to have a bigger budget, but that would require higher taxes.
So you're not blocking the defence?
I've provided the allocation of money
as requested by the MOD,
as agreed with the MOD in the spending review last year, which was the biggest uplift in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
You're not blocking, okay. And I mean, do you trust that the MOD will spend money well? You've been very careful in your language about it. It's important that it spends it well, but do you trust that the current MOD will spend that money well? Because we've had NEO reports ad infinitum, £14 billion gap in the defence equipment plan, rolling repeatedly, Ajax failing still.
There have clearly been failures to get value for money with defence spending over a number of years, and that needs to improve. But I'm absolutely confident that the Secretary of State for Defence is doing exactly that. I'm also very keen that the increased capital spending that we put in my first budget and at the spending review is spent in Britain, and as a government I want to do much more to ensure that through government procurement we're supporting jobs and apprenticeships and investment in Britain, and obviously defence, with a big increase in the budget that they've had, need to play an important part in ensuring that.
Thank you. Mr Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up Mr Coughlin's point on the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, I know the government is considering multilateral propositions around procurement, but obviously the bank is specifically about capital and mobilising capital. So is the government considering that proposition directly or other multilateral propositions, particularly around capital rather than just procurement, because they are trying to solve two different issues?
Yes, we are absolutely looking at a whole range of issues where allies can work.
On the specific thing on the bank, is that a realistic, something you're really examining?
Something that lends to sovereigns and companies, yes.
Okay, thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that are updated in the EFO were the immigration figures, and I think this was driven partly by the ONS revising their own figures because of a change in methodology. And what it shows is that more people have been leaving Britain than we first thought, and that this is driving the overall lower net migration figures. Is this a concern to you?
The Office of Budget Responsibility have used the most recent ONS numbers and projections. We made a commitment in our manifesto that we wanted net migration to fall, and also to have greater control over who comes into this country, which is why the Home Secretary has has changed the rules, particularly around low-skilled migration, whilst at the same time providing more high-talent visas for academics, for researchers and for entrepreneurs to come to Britain to create jobs and bring investment here. And I think that is the right approach. I think what the OBR say around GDP and GDP per capita is quite interesting. As Mr. Glenn said earlier, for this coming year, GDP has been revised down slightly, although then revised up in subsequent years. But what is the case over the course of this Parliament is that GDP per capita has been revised up in the spring forecast, and that reflects the lower migration assumptions. Now, in the end, as I said in my answer to Dame Meg's question, the reason we want to grow the economy is to make working people better off. And so GDP divided by the number of people in the country is the best measure of understanding that. And so those net migration numbers, whilst there's been very little change overall across the forecast period in terms of GDP itself, means that GDP per capita has been revised up.
I am going to probe into inward migration a bit more, but that initial question was about the people that are leaving. So we now understand that more people are leaving Britain than we previously thought they were, and I wondered whether that was a concern to you, that we're having sort of skilled potential. We don't know necessarily the entire makeup of them, but is it a concern to you that more people are leaving than we thought before?
I think, look, obviously, need to better understand the mix of that, but some of those will be people who came to this country from abroad and are now going back to that country. But Dom, did you want to add something?
Just say the ONS revision from the 18th of November looked at 2021 to 2024, so it was a backwards-looking assessment of British immigration, which then did conclude that over that period British immigration could be higher. The OBR then takes that ONS data as a starting point, so it's not a sort of something new is happening now. It's that the ONS, having looked at what happened over 2021 to 2024, have revised.
I understand it was a methodological change, but it still means that people were leaving at a higher rate than we thought.
It means they had in the past left at a higher rate than thought, and then they've used those projections to extrapolate going forward.
So moving on to inward migration then. The data that I've been looking at in the report suggests that immigrants tend to have a similar skill distribution to the UK population and tend to be more likely to be of working age. And so this seems to me to be a fiscal plus. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, it depends with what you're looking for. If you want to double the size of GDP, you could, I guess, double the number of people that were in the country, but that wouldn't actually make anyone better off. What we want is growth that actually makes people better off. And so just adding to the number of people doesn't necessarily make anybody better off. And so that's why the GDP per capita numbers have always been seen as a better measure of what impact that growth is having on ordinary people. And then just going back, I guess, linking to the point that Mr. Glenn was making earlier around employment in Britain, there are too many young people who are not in education, employment or training at all. And I would prefer that those job vacancies are filled by people who are here and seeking work, which does require things like the youth job guarantee. It does require tilting the apprenticeship system.
Which we've discussed before,
but it relates to the immigration issue, because I just don't buy this idea that the only way for businesses to fill vacancies is to bring people in from overseas.
I agree, Mr. Dean. Yeah, I agree with your overall assessment about just having people and adding to GDP not being particularly useful. But my question was about how that they tend to be more of a working age, they have a similar skill profile to the British population, and with the ageing population, that even if you train up all the young people tomorrow that we have available to us, there will still be gaps in the workforce. And so is that not fiscal plus?
Well, so where there are genuine gaps in the workforce, and that is exactly what the immigration system and the rules are there to do, to make sure that we do plug genuine gaps in the workforce. But we do have too many young people particularly who are not working at the moment, and we need to do more to make sure that they have got the skills to match the job opportunities that do exist in the economy, because there are still a number of vacancies are at a pretty stable rate at the moment. I am I want to do more, as we are doing through the jobs guarantee and tilting the apprenticeship programme, to make sure that people who are already here get those opportunities.
The reason I asked the question, because the overall rhetoric coming from the government and particularly the Home Office, is that we just want to drive the immigration figures down, and there's an assumption built in that immigration is causing problems for our economy. And I just wonder whether you in the Treasury have any tensions with the Home Office with that rhetoric, because there is some value to the economy too from migration.
Yeah, there absolutely is, when we lack specific skills in the UK, but then that should also be a wake-up call that we should be training people up in those areas. If there is a part of the economy where we don't have the skills that we need, we should be training up more people who are already here to be able to do those jobs and benefit from them. So there's definitely not a tension here between the Treasury and the Home Office. I want to make sure that we've got an immigration system that plugs skills gaps, but also welcomes to Britain some of the best talent from around the world, whether that be university researchers or entrepreneurs that are looking for a place to do their work and to grow their business. But I do want to make sure that people who are already in this country are getting the opportunities, and that's why I've put so much extra investment, for example, into further education college and into apprenticeships, because I desperately desire our young people to be able to take the opportunities that exist in our economy.
Thank you very much, Mr Dean. Yuan Yang, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, you mentioned the proposed changes to settlement criteria and to settlement periods. What modelling has the Treasury made of these proposed changes? Do you think it will be impact the fiscal stance significantly?
All of the sort of impacts we've seen on migration so far, so the fall from the highs in 2023 down to the OBR's assessment for this year is, I think, 200,000. Next year also about 200,000. All of that is accounted for both in the sort of economy forecast and the fiscal forecast. Obviously, to the extent that changed going forward, that would be accounted for by the OBR in the next forecast.
Have you made independent assessments of the proposed changes to settlement policy?
Well, I think some of the detail of some of that is still being consulted on. I think there are sort of impact assessments in the normal way, and then the way we'd account for it formally in the forecast is after the policy has been firmly decided.
The reason I ask is because the Home Office have set out their policy based on arguments around the fiscal impact of the net migration that happened during the Boris Johnson era. So I was wondering where that fiscal impact was being calculated, and if not in the Treasury, then where that calculation was coming from. Do you have oversight of that?
Well, we work closely with the Home Office as they do their regular impact assessments. They publish those around the time when they consult on policies as well, but obviously the final sort of arbiter and judge will be the OBR when they account for it in the forecasts.
You've not made your own assessment within the Treasury of that fiscal impact?
We'd in ongoing conversations with the Home Office and obviously as part of publishing impact assessments, which I think we have done to some extent and will do further.
Perhaps you could write to us with detail about who's doing what assessment.
Just in general though, I don't want the Treasury to be a department that second guesses other departments. It sort of relates to the question about SEND earlier as well. The Treasury are not there to mark the homework of government departments, but to work with them to properly understand the assessments. So I don't want a Home Office impact assessment and a Treasury impact assessment.
No, I think that's why I'm asking if you could write, because it sounds like
we do it together. We work on these things together.
But it is pretty critical to the mission of the Treasury too.
It is, but we work together rather than having two different.
But we just, I think, as parliamentarians, as Parliament, as the public, we just want to know what the thinking is and the assessment that's been done. Thank you very much, Ms Yang. Dame Harriet.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, we've heard from the Office for Budget Responsibility that more Brits are leaving the UK. Anecdotally, you hear people use phrases like there's a millionaire leaving the UK every 45 minutes. But we also heard that there's very little data on the tax paid by those leaving and the tax paid by those coming in. So I just wondered if you or any of your ministers have commissioned any work from HMRC to find out what the tax implications of this change in the UK population is.
Well, I think as Dharmesh Nai said a minute ago, that the numbers around people leaving is based on past data from the previous Parliament that they're then extrapolating going forward rather than information about what's happened in the last year. But do you want to elaborate?
Yes, so again, the ONS looked at 2021 to 2024. I mean, what particularly happened is there was a sort of blip from the trend immediately after the pandemic in terms of the number of Brits leaving the country. Having looked again at that period, they've revised that up, although it is back to essentially historic norms.
We can see what they say. I just really wondered whether the Chancellor's worried about the potential for now there being more people who pay more tax leaving the country than there are people coming in, and the tax that they pay. I just wondered if you'd actually asked the question, Chancellor.
Are you referring particularly to non-DOMs or more generally?
No, it could be young people who are on a high income who decide to go somewhere else where they might pay less tax. I just wondered whether you'd asked the question, that's all.
Well, we're always looking at the impacts of policies. So, for example, the OBR, when we made our changes to the non-dom policy, assumed that I think 25% of non-doms would move as a result, but that it would result in, what was it, £9 billion? Something like £9 billion of tax revenue, because people who remained in this country will now be paying the same tax as people who were always domiciled for tax purposes in this country. And
has that forecast proved accurate? Do you know?
Well, obviously, it is too early to say exactly, but we've got no evidence to suggest from HMRC that it is either higher or lower than that amount. And obviously, we are monitoring closely, but at the moment, and the OBR of course have done 2 more forecasts since then and haven't changed their assessment either.
It'd be helpful if you could write to us about what analysis is done. So care workers coming in will pay less tax than people, and I've got people in my constituency who are professionals and wondering what to do with the current proposal changes, and they're higher rate taxpayers. So it would be helpful to know if there's any thinking that your department can share with us. That would be great. Thank you.
Chair, and further to that point, the Migrant Advisory Committee, which is set up in order to provide quite reliable data, what work is actually happening to assess, let's say, for example, the aircraft engineer, the chemical scientists, the experienced cancer nurse, which obviously is really important for our NHS goals, who are writing in to MPs, and we've got a lobby today, I think, saying these leave to remain provisions are way too draconian, and this will end up in actually being a net loss to the economy. It's not just the fact that the taxation that they pay. What's your assessment of the fact that it's the churn which employers then have to stop, put out a job ad, get somebody else or train somebody up? So what's the impact of that over this financial year if there's that many people who feel, on balance, the leave to remain provisions are so draconian that they're going to...
Thank you, Chancellor.
Being consulted on. I think there's still consultation going on at the moment, but if the committee would like, we can write to you with ours and the Home Office assessments. Obviously, the Migration Advisory Committee sits in the Home Office rather than the Treasury. But we're happy to do that.
But it's meant to give data so that
but it sits in the Home Office. But we're happy to work with them and provide that information.
It is probably the Home Office has a slightly different take on migration to the economic impacts of it. So it's we're very helpful, and we might want to take that discussion forward in another session. Thank you very much, Chancellor. Jim Dixon, MP.
Thank you, Dame. Meg, just a couple of questions about student finance. It's very topical at the moment. We all know that graduates on Plan 5 repayment plans are struggling, that they're going to have those debts potentially deep into their middle age and beyond into retirement, and this has been potentially exacerbated by the decision in the budget to freeze the threshold at which payments are made by graduates. Are you worried about the ability of graduates to, for instance, then take on a mortgage, start a family, all those things that it's great for them to do and important for the economy for people to be able to do?
So I think it's the Plan 2 student loans where we are freezing the threshold.
Plan 5 kicks in the autumn, doesn't it, when people start paying back on Plan 5, not till the autumn.
Yeah, but the only changes we've made are around Plan 2.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not this year, it is next year. The previous government, I think, froze the threshold on Plan 2 student loans for 10 years. And so this is not something new, it's something that's happened in the past. And of course, we're also freezing tax and national insurance thresholds as well. But I do recognise that we inherited a broken system when it comes to student finance, as we inherited a broken NHS, a prison system, and much more. And as a government, we have to deal with all of these things, but also in a hierarchy of priorities. And you can see from my first two budgets and my spending review that the priorities have been the NHS and defence, where we've put the most additional money into those two departments, given the particular needs and challenges facing us as a country. But also on student loans, for all of the different plans, they are linked to, the repayment is linked to inflation. And one of the challenges over the last 2 years is that inflation has been at too high a level. It reached just over 11% under the previous government. It is now coming down, but every time we get inflation down, we are reducing the interest charged on student loans. And so one of the best ways we can help finances of graduates is to continue our drive to bring down inflation and bring down interest rates, because that is what will reduce their monthly repayments.
Mr. Dixon.
Thank you for that answer. The Education Secretary is clearly concerned, as are others in government, that there might need to be reforms to the financing system. I think she said that she wants a fairer system, and her department is in talks with the Treasury. What options are you considering to make the student loan system fairer, and are you likely to be setting out any details of reforms in due course?
Yeah, well, one of the reforms that we've already made is to reintroduce the maintenance grants for students from low-income families, which we know can be a deterrent for young people going to university. And we're also uprating maintenance loans, which had previously been, I think, frozen. So we are making reforms to the system for people going to university today, whilst also bringing down inflation and interest rates to help graduates who are currently repaid. Obviously, the student loan system is a policy area that is for the Department for Education, in the same way that SEND is for the Department for Education, and I'm sure that the Secretary of State for Education will continue to look at the system, but I would just go back to the challenge that all governments have, but particularly given the inheritance that this government has had, to fund all of our public services, whether that is SEND, whether it is lifting children out of poverty, or whether it is reducing NHS waiting lists, or increasing the defence budget. And the truth is, we can't do everything straight away. And I do believe that the priorities of investing in the NHS and in defence, but also in the most recent spring forecast to put aside that much needed money for SEND, are the right policies and is the right approach.
So it is possible that the Secretary of State is going to come forward with some changes to the student loan system because of the unfairnesses we're seeing and which are being highlighted?
We've already made some changes around maintenance loans and maintenance grants, but any change that we made would have to be fully costed and fully funded. But this year, the thresholds for repayments are going up. And inflation is coming down, which will reduce the monthly repayments.
Thank you, Damien.
And of course, it would be, presumably then from what you're saying, it would be a matter for a future spending review, for the next spending review round.
Yes, and it would be weighed up against other priorities.
But it would be a bid by the Department for Education if there was
and to be looked at against other demands.
Absolutely, no, but just in terms of what you're saying, if there's not money now, it has to be bid for in future. So
we've moved to having just one budget a year.
But it's a spending review matter, because it would have to come out of the Department for Education, so there would have to be a spending review decision.
Well, obviously it was a budget decision to do the threshold changes, wasn't it?
Yes, so that's a budget decision, but for other changes, any other major change would be a spending review matter.
Well, it could either be a budget or a...
it could be a budget. Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you very much indeed. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Zooming out a bit on this issue of student loans, for the first time in modern British history, young people are expected to be poorer than their parents. And I appreciate the mentions you made of the changes to maintenance loans, to the Renters Rights Act, for example, to minimum wages for young people, which will all help young people. But on this greater picture of things, how concerned are you that this issue of declining intergenerational living standards will continue to the end of this Parliament? And more broadly, do you think the state has got the balance right between spending on older people and younger people?
Well, one of the things that I did in the budget last year was to get rid of the two-child limit within the universal credit system, which lifts almost 500,000 children out of poverty. The biggest thing we could have done to change the trajectories, the lives of some of the poorest children in the country. Obviously, that came with a fiscal cost, but it was the right thing to do to invest in our young people and in their futures. Similarly, bringing down interest rates is a policy that disproportionately benefits younger people, because younger people are less likely to be saving and more likely to be borrowing, whether it is to pay for the 45% of young people who go to university, to pay the student fees, or indeed whether it is getting your first mortgage. And so our policy of returning stability to the economy and bringing down inflation and interest rates is pro young people at the start of their working lives as well. In addition, we're building 1.5 million homes, which is particularly good for young people and first-time buyers getting a start on the housing ladder. So I think there's an awful lot in our policies, and indeed the £4.1 billion additional we're putting in to send every single year to give children in our schools a good start in life. So I just don't accept the premise at any level at all that this government is not supporting young people.
Thank you, Ms Yang.
Yes, Chancellor, you talked about your youth guarantee and apprenticeships to help deal with the record youth unemployment. But can we turn to AI? How do you see AI? It's obviously could have a massive effect on the economy and employment. Could you tell us what assessment you made and what the Treasury is doing to evaluate its effect on the labour market?
Yeah. AI is already having a big effect on the economy, and some of the real-time data on productivity show that productivity has actually been pretty strong in the last year or so, and part of that, although we're still working through the numbers as are other economists, but part of that will reflect a greater use of technology and AI in the economy, whether that's in public services or in the private sector, and that gives real opportunities for us as a country, particularly as a country that tends to adopt technology faster than some other countries around the world. But all the evidence from history, from any other sort of industrial revolution or technological change, is that countries that embrace that change and get the front of it benefit the most from it in two ways. First of all, you attract the businesses at the frontier who are creating the new technologies, and also countries that adopt in the wider economy and through the skills system the ability to use and work with the new technologies as well. So that's why, as a government, we are embracing this moment. If you think about our skills mix, and we've got a highly skilled economy. If you think about our universities, which are some of the best in the world, our R&D spending, which is going up, all of these are reasons to think that we're a country that can really benefit and reap the rewards of these new technologies. And I'm determined that we are. But that does, and it links back, as you right at the beginning of your question, to opportunities around jobs and skills. And it is absolutely imperative that we therefore tilt our education and our skills system to ensure that people have got the skills to be able to use and work in these sectors. Obviously, there will be dislocations in the labour market, but what matters is how you respond to that and whether you're giving young people skills they need. And we're working, again, this is about the active and strategic state, working with the private sector to skill and train people up, whether they work in small businesses or larger businesses, to be able to embrace these new technologies.
So Glenn.
I don't really disagree with any of that, but the point is there's rapid change. There people are saying that in 2 years call centres won't exist. There could be significant segments of both geographically and across the age distribution of jobs that will not exist. Can you give us any more information about what the Treasury thinks about the job losses consequential of AI? Because they are real, and you'll have to deal with those as Chancellor in real time, even if there's a positive effect overall of AI for productivity.
Chancellor.
Britain has already attracted many global tech companies to this country, and we're also growing our existing businesses. So one of the points of the pensions reform, for example, is to enable innovative businesses that are starting in this country to scale in this country, and changes to the listings rules and the tax incentives for entrepreneurs and scale-ups is all about trying to keep those businesses in this country. And we're having some success on that. Spin-outs from Google DeepMind are only staying in this country because we managed to keep DeepMind in this country. Wave, a great technology company based in Cambridge, is employing I think 1,500 people in the UK now. So there are jobs to be had in this sector as long as we stay at the cutting edge of those technologies and are training people up to do these jobs, which is what some of our skills and educational reforms are about doing, but also working with the private sector, who are putting huge resources in as well to training people up.
I understand the emphasis you put on, I think, policies that were some of which were started during my tenure as Economic Secretary, which I agree with respect to investment and growth capital. But what I'm suggesting to you is that the impact and jobs lost in the immediate term is real and significant. Now, you can talk about training people to the future, but what assessment has been made by the Treasury about jobs lost to AI in this Parliament?
It's no.
Well, we are also working closely with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology's Future of Work unit, which was established earlier this year. That unit's job is to provide analysis to ministers across government on the impacts of AI on the economy and labour markets. It's backed by a panel of businesses and trade unions, and its job is also to help advise on what any new policies that should be implemented as a result. So that is sort of the primary mechanism in government for some of the analysis.
Because lots of businesses are very worried about it.
Well, they were established earlier this year, but we can probably write to you with where they've got to.
We've spoken to chief execs of banks and financial institutions worried about the cohort that will just lose, they won't need because of AI, but then how they're going to grow the next middle managers. So there's a very big question here, isn't there, Chancellor, about how we make sure those jobs of the future are provided in real time to fill those gaps.
In the spending review last year, we invested in things like sovereign compute, the biggest supercomputer up at Edinburgh University. Things like this are about ensuring that when a scale-up business or a multinational business is thinking about where to invest, they choose the UK. That's where we get the jobs from.
But if you're working in a bank now at a middle level, graduate, postgraduate trainee level, graduate trainees even, then there are those jobs no longer exist, which we've heard thousands will be going in that sector. one, they worry about how they're going to grow those middle managers, but they also worry about the people who will not be employed, and that's thousands and thousands of people.
But there are also thousands and thousands of jobs being created every single day.
That's just the plan, is that they
technology.
So the plan will be to replicate, that will create the new jobs to counterbalance.
As in every wave of technological change in the world, you've never been able to hold on to the past. What you have to do is embrace the future, but the government have got a key role there in making sure that we skill people up. But I take my city of Leeds. It was built along the canals with the with the mills. The mills now host great start-up and scale-up businesses in technology. No, actually, on the edge of my constituency, Castleton Mills, or in the centre of my constituency, Sunnybank Mills, now employs as many people today as it did when it was a woolen mill, but now it's created.
I just really wanted to
businesses.
get on your alert to the challenge as the disruptor businesses come in, that some of the old jobs will go, and there will be a potential time lag between the old and the new jobs.
I am an optimist about these things, not a pessimist. There are more jobs in the economy today than when I became Chancellor of the Exchequer, despite the extraordinary growth of technology and AI. Every industrial revolution has resulted in changes in the jobs that people do and the way that they do them. But more people are working today in the UK than any year apart from 3 in the last 100. So I remain positive, as long as you've got a government that is working with business to make sure that we are skilling and training people up, and that is exactly what we're doing.
Thank you. Bobby Dean MP.
Thank you, Chair. You've talked about planning reforms and house building being key to the growth plan, which I think is welcome, but the OBR have said for the second year running that the government looks set to miss its targets. How important is that 1.5 million homes target to the public finances?
The key reason we want to build 1.5 million homes is because we want young people and first-time buyers to be able to realise that dream of home ownership, and also we want more social and affordable housing, including council housing, so that people who are privately renting can have greater security. It's also why we've done the Renters' Rights Act as well, to give young people and families in rented accommodation greater rights and security. But building 1.5 million homes is still very much the ambition and priority of this government.
Mr. Dean.
So house building in London in particular this year is said to have collapsed. Only 5,000 private sector starts in 2025. The government's put quite a lot of emphasis on its growth strategy via this route, but it's quite a cyclical industry, and it's not just the planning reforms that I guess will affect this. Is that a concern for the government?
So I think we've now published the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, along with the Mayor of London, have published some specific London reforms to boost house building in London, where you're right, it has lagged behind the rest of the country over the last couple of years, but we're turning that around. But we're also stimulating the demand side as well through lower interest rates, and the number of first-time buyers in the market, I think, is at its highest level since the financial crisis, except for the year after COVID, when obviously people returned to the market. But lower interest rates is obviously bringing more people into the housing market. And I was with the Building Societies Association, I think it was 2 Fridays ago, with all of the building societies who are a key lender into the first-time buyer segment, and changes that I announced in my Mansion House speech has resulted in making it easier to lend to first-time buyers, bringing more of them into the market.
Thank you. And can I just put to you something that came up on a joint committee with MHCLG? We asked about whether the Treasurer did any sort of value for money for the taxpayer analysis of local authorities building council homes directly. Now, we understand there will probably be an analysis about the rental income over 30, 40, 50 year period, but there's also the element of the DWP paying out housing benefit. Yeah. Is that taken into consideration? Do Treasury look at that in the main, look at the money going out via housing benefits, look about the money that could come into local authorities when making decisions about how much capital local authorities are allowed to borrow to build?
Yes, we do look at those things, and as much as possible we try and reflect them in our forecasts. Sometimes, obviously, things require an upfront cost to realise benefits further down the line. But that's the whole approach that we've taken with more investment in capital. It's also why, as my answer to Mr. Glenn's question earlier, I said that it was important to look at total departmental budgets and not just the day-to-day spending, because obviously you can get down costs for DWP and MHCLG if you invest in housing today for exactly the reasons that you said.
Because those returns happen over the very long term, usually decades away, do you think that the current way that you manage public finances is able to realise those benefits?
Well, we have put £39 billion into building more social and affordable housing in this Parliament, so there's no lack of ambition from this government in realising the benefits of those investments.
Thank you very much. Catherine West, MP.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the 39 billion, which is already profiled across the 10 years, if some of that could be released at a pilot scheme level, so that local authorities can actually start building on their own land, which of course provides a very quick planning application, and in fairly small bunches, for example, disabled housing, but it does create the chain back into both registered social landlords and councils. I think that might be worth trying, just to get that 5,000.
Is that a prospect, Chancellor?
I mean, those would be decisions for MHCLG and local government.
It's already been profiled, so it's more money.
Well, and it's then up to the department how to spend it. I would just say, as a government, like I said in the previous answer, we do not want to micromanage departments at the Treasury. I do not believe, as brilliant as my officials are, that the Treasury always knows best. And
well, that's a first for a Chancellor.
Quite radical.
A radical change of direction.
This might be a radical change, but trusting colleagues and other departments.
Actually, dismay from officials.
Mr. Glenn might have a question about that.
Dismay from officials behind you, I have to say. No, I joke. But, well, that'll be interesting. Other departments will be interested to hear that. That's probably the most newsworthy of today's session. But before we finally finish, I just wanted to. We had a bit of delay in getting a recruitment going for the new chair of the OBR. Was there a reason for that?
We wanted to make sure that we understood what the skills and the qualities we were looking for in a new chair. We were always
different. Are they different? Do they materialise as different?
Well, you've seen the
I've seen that, but I didn't notice a particular difference. That's what
one of the things that we've been working with the other two members of the BRC is what the role is of the OBR and the BRC and how they do their forecasts. And so we've done that work and now advertised this role. We always knew we wouldn't have a new chair in for the spring forecast, but we will for the next budget.
Okay, so do you know what's the recruitment timetable currently?
I think the applications closes at the end of this month.
Yeah. Okay. So because we'll obviously want to see them as we have to see them as a pre-commencement hearing in order to do that. Can I thank you then very much indeed for your time, Chancellor, and for Mr. Stenay. A transcript of this will be available for the hordes of people out there who want to see it uncorrected on the website in the next couple of days. Thank you to our colleagues at Hansard. Thank you to our colleagues at Bowtie for the broadcasting. Thank you again, Chancellor.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Thank you very much.
Order.